December 12, 1944. Camp McCain, Mississippi. The transport truck rolled through the gates of the prisoner of war facility, just as winter dusk settled over the pine forests of eastern Mississippi. Inside, 43 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had once filled them properly. They had traveled for 3 days from the port in New York, processed through multiple facilities, each stop revealing more about the country that had defeated their armies in France. But nothing had prepared the American soldiers at Camp McCain for what stepped off that truck. Colonel Edward Lewis stood beside the vehicle as the rear gate dropped open, his weathered face arranged in the formal expression he had worn through countless prisoner arrivals over the past 2 years. He had overseen the processing of thousands of German soldiers, Italian prisoners, even a few Japanese sailors. He considered himself beyond surprise. He was wrong. The first woman to descend was Martha Schaefer, 24 years old, former radio operator from Berlin. She moved with deliberate precision, her back straight despite obvious exhaustion. But it was her face that made Colonel Lewis's breath catch. Her cheekbones protruded sharply beneath skin stretched thin as parchment. Her eyes, a pale blue that might once have been striking, sat deep in hollow sockets rimmed with the purple shadows of prolonged malnutrition. Her hands, gripping the side of the truck for balance, were skeletal. Behind her came the others, each one a testimony to the collapsing German war machine. Johanna Fischer, just 19, looked like a child playing dress-up in an adult's uniform. Margarete Krause, the 31-year-old nurse, had the haunted expression of someone who had seen too much suffering and absorbed too little nourishment herself. Else Bauer moved carefully, as if uncertain her legs would support her weight. And Clara Vogel, the unresistion, the Vater dwellte attentively, 22-year-old radio technician, had to be helped down by 2 guards, her strength nearly spent. Lieutenant Alice Moore, assigned to oversee the female prisoners, felt her professional composure crumble. She had been a schoolteacher in Ohio before the war, accustomed to caring for young women not much different in age from these prisoners. But she had never seen anything like this. These weren't defeated soldiers. They were walking ghosts, women whose bodies had been consuming themselves for months, maybe years. Private Tommy Reeves, the 20-year-old farm boy from Iowa, whispered to the soldier beside him, "My God, they're starving." His voice carried in the quiet evening air, and several of the German women turned toward him. They didn't understand his English words, but they understood his tone. It held something they hadn't heard in a very long time. Not pity, exactly, something closer to horror. Martha Schaefer met the young private's gaze and saw his shock. She straightened her spine another impossible inch, determined to maintain dignity even as her stomach cramped with a hunger that had become her constant companion. Martha Schaefer had not always been hungry. She remembered Berlin before the war, before the bombs, before the ration cards became worthless slips of paper promising food that no longer existed. She remembered her mother's kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread, the weight of a full plate, the simple luxury of eating until satisfaction rather than stopping when the meager portion ended. That world had vanished gradually, so slowly that she hadn't noticed until it was gone. The rations had decreased year by year. First the luxuries disappeared, then the staples dwindled, then even the basics became unreliable. By 1943, when she had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, she was already accustomed to constant hunger. The military had promised better food for those who served. It was a lie, but a seductive one. Her assignment to France in early 1944 had come with whispered promises of access to French resources, to the food that occupied territories could provide. Another lie. The Wehrmacht took everything of value and left scraps for their support personnel. Martha and the other women in her communications unit survived on thin soup made from vegetable peelings, bread so dense with sawdust it barely qualified as food, and ersatz coffee that tasted like burned dirt. Johanna Fischer had believed the propaganda longer than most. Even as her body withered, she had repeated the phrases about sacrifice for the fatherland, about how their suffering would ensure victory, about how the enemy lived in decadent excess, while Germans showed their superior character through discipline and deprivation. She had believed it right up until the moment American soldiers captured their unit outside of Metz in November. The Americans who took them prisoner had been eating chocolate. Johanna had stared at the brown bars they pulled casually from their pockets, sharing them with each other as if such abundance was normal, expected, unremarkable. One soldier had even offered her a piece. She had been too shocked to accept, certain it was some kind of trick or test. Later, locked in the temporary holding facility, she had wept silently, mourning not her capture but the realization that everything she had been told was backwards. If the decadent Americans had chocolate to spare, what did that make German deprivation? Sacrifice, or simply suffering? Margarete Krause had watched women die of starvation in the military hospital where she worked in France. Not from wounds, not from disease, but from bodies simply giving up after too many months of too little food. She had held their hands as they faded, had written letters to families who were likely just as hungry back in Germany, had wondered when her own body would decide it had endured enough. She had a daughter named Sophie, 8 years old, living with Margarete's mother in Hamburg. Every night Margarete prayed that somehow her child was finding food, that her mother's connections and resourcefulness were keeping Sophie alive. But she had received no letters in 8 months. The silence terrified her more than captivity ever could. The morning after their arrival, Lieutenant Alice Moore came to escort the German women to breakfast. She had spent a sleepless night thinking about their condition, about the protocol she was supposed to follow, and about the simple human reality that these women needed food more than they needed processing paperwork. She had spoken with Colonel Lewis at dawn, and he had agreed. Feed them first. Everything else could wait. Martha Schaefer stood when the lieutenant entered the barracks, automatically bringing herself to attention. Behind her, the other women rose as well, their movements stiff and uncertain. They had been given rough wool blankets the night before, the first warm covering many of them had experienced in months, and several had been too overwhelmed to sleep, afraid that closing their eyes would make the warmth disappear. "Good morning," Lieutenant Moore said in careful, slow English. She gestured toward the door. "Breakfast, food." She mimed eating, feeling foolish but determined to communicate clearly. Martha's eyes widened slightly. She understood some English from her school days, and she translated quickly for the others in rapid German. The word, food, created a visible ripple through the group. Johanna's hand went instinctively to her hollow stomach. Clara swayed slightly, as if the mere mention of eating had made her lightheaded. They walked across the compound in formation, military training overriding physical weakness. But their discipline couldn't hide the way their eyes darted around the camp, taking in details that contradicted everything they knew about prisoner treatment. The American soldiers they passed looked healthy, well-fed, their uniforms clean and properly fitted. The buildings were maintained, painted, solid. There were no signs of deprivation, no evidence of a nation struggling under the weight of total war. The mess hall loomed before them, a long wooden structure with windows that actually had glass in them. Lieutenant Moore pulled open the door, and the smell that rushed out stopped the German women in their tracks. Hot food. Real food. The rich aroma of cooking meat, fresh bread, coffee that smelled like actual coffee rather than the burned grain substitute they had choked down for years. Else Bauer made a small sound in her throat, halfway between a gasp and a sob. Sergeant William Tucker stood inside, having arrived at the mess hall 2 hours before dawn to prepare for this moment. Colonel Lewis had briefed him on the prisoners' condition, and Bill had seen their faces when they arrived. He was a man who had lost his wife to illness 3 years ago, who had found purpose in feeding people, who believed that a good meal could heal wounds that medicine couldn't reach. He had prepared accordingly. The tables were set with metal trays, cups, utensils arranged with care. But it was what waited behind the serving line that made Martha's careful composure finally crack. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, and tears she had refused to shed, through months of hunger and defeat, began streaming down her gaunt face. Sergeant Tucker had made a decision that would be talked about for decades afterward. He had prepared the same meal that American soldiers received. Not reduced portions, not prisoner rations, not the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. The same meal. When Corporal David Chen had questioned this choice in the pre-dawn kitchen, Tucker had simply said, "Look at them, David. Look at those women, and tell me you could serve them less." Martha stood at the front of the line, trying to process what she was seeing. A thick slice of meatloaf, glistening with a rich, brown gravy. A generous mound of mashed potatoes, real butter melting into a golden pool at the summit. Green beans, not the withered, half-rotten vegetables she had grown accustomed to, but fresh, vibrant, seasoned with small bits of bacon. 2 slices of white bread, soft and pillowy, real butter in a small paper cup, and in a separate cup, cherry cobbler, the red fruit visible beneath a golden crust. Her hands trembled as she held out her tray. Sergeant Tucker served her himself, his portions generous, his eyes kind but professional. "Ma'am," he said quietly, though she didn't understand his words. Behind Martha, Johanna began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face as her tray filled with more food than she had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. Lieutenant Moore guided them to tables, helping the women who were too overwhelmed to move on their own. Clara sat down heavily, staring at her tray as if it might vanish if she looked away. Marguerite's hands hovered over her. Food. Uncertain where to begin. Afraid that picking up her fork would break whatever spell had conjured this abundance. It was Else who moved first. She picked up her fork with shaking hands, cut a small piece of meatloaf, and brought it to her mouth. The taste of real meat, properly seasoned, cooked with care, rather than merely boiled into submission, hit her senses like a physical blow. She made a sound that was half moan, half sob, and then she was eating with desperate intensity, forgetting manners, forgetting military bearing, forgetting everything except the overwhelming need to consume this miracle before it disappeared. Her breakdown triggered the others. Within seconds, all 43 women were eating with a ferocity that made the American soldiers standing guard look away in discomfort. Johanna shoveled mashed potatoes into her mouth so fast she began to choke, coughing and crying simultaneously. Martha tried to maintain some dignity, tried to eat slowly, but her body betrayed her, her fork moving faster and faster as years of deprivation overrode her conscious control. Margarete ate with one hand while the other clutched her stomach, as if trying to hold the food inside her body through sheer force of will. Clara finished her entire meal in less than 5 minutes, then sat staring at her empty tray with an expression of devastation, as if she had lost something precious rather than consumed it. Private Tommy Reeves stood against the mess hall wall, his rifle held loosely in hands that had forgotten their purpose. He was supposed to be guarding these women, maintaining security, ensuring proper protocol. Instead, he was witnessing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not horror, exactly, but something equally profound. The raw, desperate humanity of people who had been starving discovering that food still existed in the world. Johanna had stopped crying long enough to start on her bread, tearing off pieces and stuffing them into her mouth without bothering to chew properly. The butter she had been given sat forgotten on her tray, the concept of spreading it apparently too time-consuming when she could be eating. She noticed it finally, stared at the small yellow square as if seeing gold, and then simply bit into it directly, consuming the entire portion in one mouthful. The richness of pure butter after years of ersatz margarine made from coal byproducts caused her eyes to roll back slightly, a moment of pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. Corporal Chen had seen poverty in San Francisco's Chinatown, had watched his own parents stretch impossible budgets to feed their children during the Depression years. But this was different. These women weren't just hungry. They were eating like people who had forgotten what it meant to be full, who had lost the ability to trust that another meal would come tomorrow. He moved along the serving line, and without being asked, began preparing second portions. Sergeant Tucker saw what David was doing and nodded his approval. He had made extra, anticipating this exact scenario. The math was simple. These women probably needed 3 or 4 days of regular meals just to begin recovering from their malnourishment. But their bodies would remember abundance from this first meal, would begin the long process of healing from this moment forward. Martha finished her meatloaf and immediately started on the green beans, eating them with her fingers when her fork proved too slow. She had maintained her composure longer than most, but the facade crumbled completely when she tasted the cherry cobbler. The sweetness, the texture of real fruit, the buttery crust, all combined into something that her starved brain interpreted as almost painfully beautiful. She bent over her tray and wept while she ate, tears falling into her food, salt mixing with sugar, her shoulders shaking with sobs she had suppressed through months of military discipline. Else had finished everything on her tray and was now running her finger across the metal surface, gathering every remaining trace of gravy, every crumb of bread, every molecule of butter. She licked her finger clean and then did it again, unable to stop herself, dimly aware that American soldiers were watching her debase herself but unable to care. Food mattered. Dignity could wait. Lieutenant Moore felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had prepared herself for many aspects of overseeing enemy prisoners. Defiance, she had expected. Hostility, certainly. Cold military professionalism, absolutely. But she had not prepared herself for this raw vulnerability, for watching grown women reduced to tears by the simple act of eating a hot meal. She caught Colonel Lewis's eye across the mess hall. His expression mirrored her own confusion of pity, anger at what had been done to these women, and determination to help them recover. When Corporal Chen approached the tables with offers of second helpings, several women looked at him with expressions of such desperate hope that he had to turn away briefly to compose himself. Margarete reached up with a trembling hand to accept another portion of mashed potatoes, and then surprised everyone by whispering in broken English, "Thank you. Thank you." The words came out thick with emotion and unfamiliar pronunciation, but their sincerity was unmistakable. The aftermath of that first breakfast created a crisis that no military manual had prepared anyone to handle. Within 2 hours, more than half the German women were violently ill. Their shrunken stomachs, accustomed to meager rations and thin soup, rebelled against the sudden influx of rich food. Margarete, the nurse, found herself caring for her fellow prisoners while fighting her own nausea, her medical training overriding her physical distress. Lieutenant Moore called for the camp physician, Dr. Benjamin Walsh, who arrived to find the women's barracks transformed into an improvised infirmary. He examined them with growing concern, noting not just the immediate digestive distress, but the underlying malnutrition that had caused it. "Severely underweight," he wrote in his report that evening. "Evidence of prolonged starvation. Vitamin deficiencies apparent. Will require careful dietary management to avoid refeeding complications." But even as their bodies protested, the women couldn't stop thinking about food. Johanna lay on her cot, clutching her cramping stomach, and whispered to Else in the next bed, "It was worth it. Even this pain, it was worth it." Else nodded weakly, understanding completely. They had been sick from hunger so many times that being sick from eating too much felt almost like a victory. Sergeant Tucker consulted with Dr. Walsh about adjusting the meal plan. Smaller portions initially, the doctor advised. More frequent meals. Foods that are easier to digest. Build them back up gradually. But Tucker could see the conflict in the physician's eyes, the same conflict he felt himself. Medical logic said, go slowly. Human compassion wanted to give them everything immediately. By evening, the women had recovered enough to gather in the barracks common area. Martha sat with her back against the wall, her diary open on her lap. She had started writing again, something she hadn't done since her capture. The words flowed in German, trying to capture the impossibility of what they had experienced. How do I write about this meal? How do I explain to myself that our enemies fed us better in one breakfast than the Reich fed us in months? What does this say about everything we believed? Clara spoke quietly in German, her voice carrying in the silent room. My brother wrote to me last year from the Eastern Front. He said the Russian prisoners they captured were starving. He said it was because the Soviets didn't care about their own soldiers. She paused, her thin frame hunched forward. But we were starving too. In our own military. The Americans have had us for one day, and they've fed us like this. What does that make us? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that went far beyond food. Johanna, the youngest, who had clung to her beliefs longer than most, spoke with a trembling voice. I thought Americans were supposed to be weak, soft. That's what we were told. That their abundance made them inferior to our discipline. She laughed, a broken sound. But they have abundance, and they share it, even with us. Even with their enemies. Margarete thought of her daughter Sophie back in Hamburg. Was her little girl as hungry as they had been? Was anyone feeding her with kindness? The thought made her chest ache worse than her overfull stomach. She had spent months telling herself that suffering for the war effort meant something noble. Now she wondered if she had simply been suffering needlessly, while men in power made promises they never intended to keep. 3 days after their arrival, Martha approached Lieutenant Moore with a carefully rehearsed request in halting English. We work, yes, kitchen, please? She gestured toward the mess hall, her meaning clear even through the language barrier. Alice Moore hesitated, considering the implications. Allowing enemy prisoners to work in food preparation raised security questions. But she also understood what Martha was really asking for. Not just activity to pass the time, but purpose, connection. A way to earn the food they were receiving. Colonel Lewis approved the request with one condition. They would work under direct supervision, and Sergeant Tucker would have final authority over their assignments. When Martha and 5 other women reported to the kitchen the next morning, Tucker greeted them with cautious welcome. He demonstrated tasks through gestures and simple words. Peeling potatoes, washing dishes, cleaning surfaces. Basic work that required no complex communication, else proved to have an instinct for cooking that surprised everyone. She watched Tucker prepare the noon meal with intense focus, absorbing techniques and measurements. When he caught her studying his movements, he paused, and then deliberately showed her how he seasoned the vegetables, how he tested the temperature of the oven, how he knew when meat was properly cooked. She nodded eagerly, her hands mimicking his motions in the air. Corporal Chen found himself working alongside Clara at the dishwashing station. She was meticulous, almost obsessive, about ensuring every plate was perfectly clean. He realized after watching her for a while that she was treating each dish with reverence, as if the objects that held food deserved respect. When he showed her a more efficient way to stack the clean dishes, she smiled at him shyly, the first genuine smile he had seen from any of the German women. The kitchen became a space where language barriers mattered less than shared purpose. Johanna learned to knead bread dough under Tucker's patient instruction, her thin arms gradually building strength through the repetitive motion. She discovered that the rhythm of kneading was meditative, allowing her mind to quiet after months of anxiety and confusion. The smell of yeast and rising dough became associated in her mind with safety, with a kind of peace she hadn't known existed. By the second week, the 6 women working in the kitchen had begun teaching German words to the American staff in exchange for English lessons. Kartoffel, Clara would say, holding up a potato. Potato, Chen would reply, and they would both repeat the words in each other's languages, laughing at their mutual pronunciation struggles. These simple exchanges built something fragile but real between former enemies. Sergeant Tucker noticed that the women who worked in the kitchen were recovering faster than those who remained idle in the barracks. They had gained weight, yes, but more than that, they had gained something in their eyes, not quite hope, not yet, but something closer to it. The possibility that they might have value beyond what their uniforms had once represented. The beginning of understanding that they were being came. Martha began to fear the worst. Perhaps Berlin had been bombed again. Perhaps her parents' building no longer existed. Perhaps they were dead, and she was writing to ghosts. Then, in late February, the first response arrived. Not for Martha, but for Clara. A single page, written in her sister's handwriting. Clara read it alone in her bunk, her hands shaking so badly the paper rustled audibly. When she finished, she folded it carefully and said nothing, but her face told the story. Her mother was dead, her father missing, her sister surviving alone in the ruins of Stuttgart. December 25, 1945. Nearly a year had passed since the German women first arrived at Camp McCain. The war in Europe had ended 7 months earlier. Japan had surrendered in August. The world was at peace, but the question of what came next for these women remained unanswered. Repatriation procedures had begun for male prisoners across the country, yet we have found hope. Her words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond that Christmas evening. The request created an unprecedented crisis for military bureaucracy. 18 of the 43 German women formally petitioned to remain in the United States rather than accept repatriation. Their reasoning was complex, emotional, and deeply practical. They had lost families to bombing raids. Their cities existed only as rubble. The country they had served, no longer existed in any recognizable form. But more than that, they had discovered something in American captivity that they wanted to spend their lives defending and sharing with others. Martha stood before Colonel Lewis in his office, serving as spokesperson for the group. Her English was now fluent, her understanding of American culture surprisingly deep after a year of daily interaction. "Colonel, we understand this is unusual. We know we were your enemies, but we have learned what America truly means. Not from propaganda, not from newspapers, but from how you treated us when you had every reason to hate us. You fed us when we were starving. You treated us with dignity when we expected cruelty. You gave us hope when we had lost everything." The military response took months. Lawyers debated legal precedents, politicians argued about optics. Would allowing former enemy soldiers to remain send them seen as human beings rather than simply as enemy prisoners who needed to be fed? In January of 1945, the International Red Cross established procedures for prisoners of war to correspond with their families. Lieutenant Moore distributed writing paper, envelopes and pencils to the German women, explaining through Martha's translation that they could send letters home. The announcement created an immediate stir of excitement followed quickly by anxiety. What would they say? What could they say? Martha sat at the barracks table with blank paper before her, pen motionless in her hand. How could she explain her situation to her parents in Berlin? She imagined them receiving a letter describing American abundance while they huddled in bomb shelters, scraping by on rations that grew smaller each week. Would they think she had been brainwashed? Would they believe her when she described being fed 3 full meals daily, about kitchen work that felt more like hospitality than imprisonment? She wrote carefully, choosing each word with diplomatic precision. "I am safe and well treated. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention strictly. I am healthy and working in the camp kitchen. Please write to me about how you are managing. I think of you constantly." She didn't mention the meatloaf, the butter, the cherry cobbler. Some truths felt too cruel to share. Johanna wrote to her mother in Munich with the enthusiasm of her 19 years, momentarily forgetting the context of her captivity. She described learning to bake bread, the kindness of Sergeant Tucker, the way Corporal Chen had taught her to say, "Good morning," in English. Only when she finished did she realize how her letter might sound. Like she was enjoying herself. Like she had forgotten she was supposed to be a prisoner of her country's enemies. She almost tore it up, then decided to send it anyway. Her mother deserved to know she was alive and safe, even if the circumstances were complicated. Marguerite's letter to her daughter Sophie was tear-stained before she finished the first paragraph. "My darling girl, I hope this letter finds you healthy and safe with Oma. I am being treated well and have enough to eat. I think of you every moment. Please be brave and good. I will come home to you as soon as I can. Your Moody loves you more than all the stars in the sky." The letters were sent through Red Cross channels in mid-January. The women waited with desperate hope for replies. Weeks passed. February arrived with cold rain that turned the camp into mud, and still no letters. The wrong message? Or would it demonstrate American values of redemption and second chances? The debate reached Washington, where officials who had never met these women made decisions about their futures based on policy rather than human reality. While bureaucracy ground slowly forward, life at Camp McCain continued its strange transformation. The German women were no longer treated as prisoners. They worked alongside American staff, attended English classes organized by Lieutenant Moore, and began learning about American civics and history. Sergeant Tucker taught cooking classes where German and American recipes merged into something new. Corporal Chen organized cultural exchange evenings where both groups shared music, stories, and slowly built friendships from the ruins of war. Margarete received a letter in March of 1946. Her daughter Sophie was alive, living with neighbors in Hamburg after Marguerite's mother had died in a bombing raid. The news was devastating and hopeful simultaneously. Sophie needed her mother, but the child was surviving, resilient in presented ways that broke and healed Margarete's heart. She made the difficult decision to accept repatriation. To return to the 43 women at Camp McCain remained in a strange limbo, neither fully prisoners nor free. Sergeant Tucker had been planning the Christmas meal for weeks. He knew this might be the last holiday these women spent in America, and he wanted to give them something to remember. Something that would perhaps soften their memories of captivity, proof that even in war, humanity could persist. He prepared a feast that rivaled anything the American soldiers would receive. Roasted turkey with sage dressing, honey-glazed ham, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, fresh rolls with real butter, cranberry sauce, and 3 different pies for dessert. The German women entered the decorated mess hall in stunned silence. Paper chains hung from the ceiling, cut and assembled by American soldiers working alongside German prisoners. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, donated by a local family who had heard about the women and wanted to contribute to their celebration. Presents wrapped in brown paper sat beneath it, small gifts purchased by staff members with their own money. Martha stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the generosity of it all. This wasn't required by any regulation or treaty. This was something else entirely. Lieutenant Moore touched her shoulder gently. "Merry Christmas, Martha," she said quietly. Martha's English had improved dramatically over the year, and she understood perfectly. "Merry Christmas, Lieutenant," she whispered back, her voice breaking. The meal was elaborate and abundant, but this time the women ate slowly, savoring rather than desperately consuming. They had gained weight over the months, their faces filling out, their bodies recovering from the starvation that had nearly destroyed them. But more than their physical transformation, something internal had shifted. They no longer ate like prisoners, afraid the food would disappear. They ate like people who had learned to trust that tomorrow would bring another meal. After dinner, Colonel Lewis stood to address the room. His words were translated by Martha, who had become the unofficial bridge between the two groups. "Ladies," he began, his voice formal but warm. "You came to us as enemies. Many of you will soon return to WWII, Germany, to rebuild your lives and your country. I hope you will remember that Americans believe in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that former enemies can become friends." Else raised her hand, surprising everyone. She stood slowly, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. In careful English she had practiced for this moment, she spoke directly to the colonel. "Sir, some of us, we do not want to go back. Germany is broken. Here, we have found something we never had before. A daughter who needed her more than she needed the promise of American abundance." Of the 18 who had requested to stay, 12 were eventually granted permission to remain as displaced persons pending immigration status. They would need sponsors, jobs, and communities willing to accept former enemies as neighbors. The process would take years, but it would succeed. Martha found sponsorship with a family in Georgia who needed a translator. Else went to Ohio to work in a hospital. Johanna, the youngest, was sponsored by Lieutenant Moore's own family, eventually attending college and becoming a teacher herself. 25 years later, Martha stood in a kitchen in Atlanta, preparing meatloaf and mashed potatoes for her American husband and their 3 children. The recipe was Sergeant Tucker's, passed down before he retired. As she spooned gravy over the meat, she remembered that first breakfast at Camp McCain, remembered weeping while she ate, remembered the moment everything changed,